I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present.
Beatty, and I made gloriously before breaking my elbow and being unable to give it. So I thought it'd be nice to give this talk as part of this, that talk as part of this talk. Damn it, something came up and that doesn't want to go. Okay. Then the second kind of key bit is looking at some stuff I did looking at, well, does the random dot motion task, the RDK, really need time varying drift rates? This is something regarding some of Philip's work with Simon Lilburn. And then the last bit's kind of a general broad kind of take of what are some different directions we can go in with RT modeling. And some, of course, everyone's got their own 2 cents on this, right? I'm no different. It's just my random thoughts. But hopefully this will give you some insight into some ways that I think RT modeling can kind of progress in the future, right? All right, so who's not familiar with diffusion modeling stuff? Okay, all right, cool. All right, so I'll give a quick intro to it then. Essentially, the idea of this model is that decisions are made through some noisy process of evidence accumulation, right? Evidence that accumulates over time, our x-axis here, and in the context of the diffusion model, one option versus the other. This is different in different variants of the models. But essentially, you can think of this as evidence accumulating over time, either towards one option or the other. The more the line goes up, the more the evidence is for one option. The more the line goes down, the more the evidence is for the other option. The evidence starts at some starting point, which reflects a priori bias, and moves at some, actually, I'll explain the constructs in a minute, and moves at some drift rate, which is kind of the driving force towards making a decision, until you hit some threshold, A, which causes you to make a decision. Now, these thresholds can be quite high as they are here, or very low as they are there, or somewhere in the middle as they are there. And these reflect different levels of caution, right? The further apart your thresholds are, the more cautious you are, the more evidence you need to make a decision. You've also got, I guess what I call, it's often treated as like the garbage bin, which is non-decision time, which is the sensory encoding and motor stuff. Now, some people, you know, sometimes we get some good work that models it well, but oftentimes it's just used as the garbage bin for response time. And what this whole process is primarily concerned with is decision time. All right. And so there's 4 kind of key constructs in the model. And that's the drift rate, V, which is how good people are at the task. Decision threshold, A, which is how cautious people are in their decisions. Starting point, Z, which is a priori bias for one option or another. And non-decision time, TR, which is the time spent on other processes. And as I said, also kind of the garbage bin. All right. So the first kind of, everyone wake up if you fell asleep during that. Okay. The first part of the talk is this 4 things that the diffusion model doesn't want you to know. Now, the diffusion model isn't really, and it could be maybe, but it isn't really an evil person in the basement trying to keep secrets from you, right? There's no diffusion QAnon, I think. But the idea here is that these are kind of a series of simulations I did to look at some, maybe not even necessarily all of them are common beliefs, but beliefs that people certainly have or that are expressed in the literature or in talks or questions or these kinds of things, right? Purely for my own personal interest, right? Because I'm like, I wonder how these things bear out in some intensive simulation, right? The first one is that some, actually, particularly myself, before having done these, are of the belief that, you know, the between trial variability parameters, which are, for those who don't know, in this process, there are also parameters that relate to between trial variability. So drift rate can vary over trials, SV, starting point can vary over trials, SZ, and non-decision time can vary over trials, ST0. So essentially this one, and this one can all have between trial variability in them in the full diffusion model. Now, I was quite of this first belief before, which is, you know, adding these between trial variabilities always has a negative influence on parameter estimation. So we've seen some evidence in the past that adding these parameters in can make parameter estimation worse, right? So you're trying to estimate these key constructs in the model to try and learn something about drift rate, threshold, non-decision time, etc. And adding these parameters in makes this estimation process worse, right? Parameters become less identifiable, etc., right? But I think there's also people on the other end, right, who believe that these parameters are perfectly fine, right? And they never cause issues in parameter estimation, right? And so I guess a reasonable place is to be between them, which I guess is where I'm moving to now. These ones are perhaps less surprising. The ones that I found really surprising were 3 and 4, right, which I'll get into, which are this idea that most people think that error RTs are very important for estimation, right? You know, it's about fitting correct and error response time distributions, right? That's kind of what we all learned, right? It's also very commonly thought that, you know, between trial variability and drift rate is very heavily determined by, you know, fast and slow errors, right? Same with SZ, right? And so you need error RTs to estimate these things. But as I'll get onto, this is actually incorrect. And then this idea of experimental conditions, right? So another key thought is that experimental constraint can be key for estimation, right? Like to properly estimate, for example, SV, we probably need a drift rate manipulation, or to manipulate, like estimate SZ, we probably need a threshold manipulation, right? This idea that having different conditions with different difficulties or different speed accuracy emphasis, all these kind of things create more constraint for the model and improve estimation. This also seems to turn out to be false. All right, and so it's going to be a lot of these plots. I'm sorry in advance. They're quite big and noisy and messy, right? But I'll try and guide you through exactly what you should be looking at, right? And so the general form of these plots is that the x-axis on every plot are data generating parameters, and the y-axis on every plot are estimated parameters. And so just as a very basic interpretation, right? Red line goes through x equals y, dots fall on red line, goods. Higher number, which is correlation between data generating and estimated values, is good, right? Now, in terms of the grouping of the plots, the top row is non-decision time, the second row is threshold, and the third row is drift rate, right? So the 3 kind of main parameters of the diffusion model that people are usually most interested in estimating, right? And then the different columns here are the different models in terms of what between trial variability parameters are included, right? So on the very left, we've got the very simple diffusion model, which only includes the base parameters. And on the other end, we've got the full diffusion model, right? If you're looking at this trying to say, that, Nathan, what the hell are you showing me? There's just a whole bunch of goddamn random plots. Yeah, that's kind of the point in a way, right? In the sense that there's not a whole lot of, like, everything looks pretty good on here, right? Whether we're looking at threshold, non-decision time, drift rates in the most simple setting or the most complex setting, right? So it very much seems to be the case that, and as I'll get to in a moment, while there can be estimation difficulties in the between trial variability parameters, it doesn't really bear out in the estimation of the regular diffusion model parameters, right? So whatever issues there are with the between trial variability parameters, it seems like, at least in this context, this is just estimating data from a single condition. We don't really seem to see those difficulties, right, in the estimation of the main parameters. So this is the point where it doesn't seem to be that there's always problems when you're using between trial variability parameters, right? However, again, I should have made these plots less noisy. Anyway, to begin with, let's just look at the first 3 columns. But this is the converse issue, right? So before I just showed you data estimated from a single condition, but this is not often the context we're interested in, right? Often the context we're interested in is that you have 2 experimental conditions and you want to know what varies over them, right? You've got some novel manipulation or different groups of people or something like this, and you want to know how they differ in these parameters, right? This would be the most common estimation context, I think, right? And we do start to see issues here, right? So to give you a quick rundown, I've got the titles up the top where simple, middle, complex refers to the type of model that's being fit. Simple is the simple diffusion model, no between trial variability parameters. Middle is the full diffusion model, but the between trial variability parameters are held constant over conditions. And complex is just letting it all kind of run wild, where you've got all between trial variability parameters and they're all allowed to vary over these 2 conditions, right? Now, the key thing to kind of look at here, I think, is the threshold column, this estimating differences in threshold across condition. Now, essentially, if you look at the other two columns, things still look pretty good, right? Like just looking at the first three, you know, everything's pretty good, right? Everything's pretty good. We've got very high correlations, things quite centered on the dot, on the x equals y line, but things start getting a bit more complex when you look at changes in threshold, right? Essentially, if you're trying to estimate changes in thresholds with the simple diffusion model and the SGM is the generating process, then things look pretty good, right? But when you start trying to estimate things with the full diffusion model, threshold gets a bit worse. And if you kind of let everything go, things get much worse, right? We start to get, you know, the correlation goes down, we start to get more and more, the variance starts increasing, right, of our generating estimating area, right? Essentially, the key point here is that parameter recovery gets much worse in this. Parameter recovery gets much worse when you start using these more complex variants of the diffusion model and you're trying to estimate differences between conditions. However, on the flip side, right, these three columns over here, the three on the right, are these misspecification fits, right? So simple, middle, those are the models being fits. MGM is middle, and these are the models being data generating, right? So to just explain, this plot here, the fourth one, is you're fitting with the simple, but you're generating with the middle, so full diffusion model. This one is you're fitting with the simple, but you're generating with the really overcomplex version. And this one is you're fitting with the middle, but you're generating with a really overcomplex version, right? The key point to take away here is that there's no winning, you know. It doesn't feel like there's any real win in the way, right? Because as soon as you start allowing for this misspecification, right, and saying that, all right, well, maybe a more complex model is generating the data than what I'm fitting, then threshold also goes to shit, right, and goes even worse to shit than in the case of the really complex diffusion model, right? So it's a case of you can let things go real complex and you lose some estimation properties. But if you don't let things go real complex and you're in any way wrong about it, things also go to shit, right? So I guess it's a bit damned if you do, damned if you don't in a way, at least from a measurement estimation perspective, right? All right, so now on to the more interesting ones, at least in my opinion. I'll do a quick magic trick. This is the plot I showed you before, right? The plot right at the, well, that's too far. Okay, so that's, well, slight lag there. Okay. Oh no, it's ruining it. Okay, so this is the plot I showed you at the very start, right? Again, the point being that estimation's pretty good overall, right? And the question is, did I just change the plot? How good are your eyes? But the point here is that I did just change the plot, right? They look very, would everyone agree that they look very similar? Right, this one is fit the standard way, right? You just fit the full diffusion model, you fit all the variants of the diffusion model, correct and error RTs, et cetera, right? This one, no error RTs, right? You're literally just fitting to the correct RTs, which is defective based on the prediction of errors, right? Essentially, no error RTs are involved in this estimation, right? Oh, yep. Right. Good question. So this isn't real data as such. This is like a massive simulation, and it's like a hypercube that covers like I think maybe 4,000 different parameter combinations. So the accuracy on each of these dots really differs anywhere from chance to, I think I throw out anything that's too high, so like 100%, but I think it goes anywhere from like 50 to 95% accuracy. Exactly. Yeah. No problem. And so it seems like you do get some issues with V up at the very end in these very complex models, right? But in general, there's very little difference between estimating without error RTs and estimating with error RTs, right? Now, I think this is interesting because people always emphasize the importance of both distributions, but also because I know lots of people like in the signal detection area, Ami always tells me this, like error RTs are probably contaminated, you can't use them. This also provides an interesting second perspective on if you're somebody who believes that error RTs are perhaps contaminated with extra processes, it does provide you a different way that you potentially fit the model, right? But the more interesting thing for me is that throwing out error RTs doesn't really change anything in terms of the estimation, right? And you're probably saying, well, Nathan, but the between trial variability parameters. So this is the estimation of the between trial variability parameters. Essentially, just to give you a quick summary, STER is like a good boy, performs pretty well all the way through. SV is actually pretty good, right? You get quite a few, you get some of this kind of cross behavior where there's some parameter combinations where it's just not identifiable, but in most cases it is, right? And SZ is just badly behaved and will not be disciplined. So essentially, the between trial variability parameters apart from SZ actually look pretty okay, right? But then the key thing is if I swap plots, they don't really get much worse, right? Like SZ does, but SZ's bad anyway. But STER doesn't really change. And the one that you probably expect to change, SV, also doesn't really change, right? So even when you're estimating without error RTs, the SV parameter, the between trial variability parameter and drift rate, which people often think are very dependent on the relative error speed, the estimation of it doesn't seem to be affected or seems to be very limited in how affected it is by completely removing error RTs. So completely removing the relative speed of correcting errors. The last kind of key point here is this idea of constraint. So as I said before, this last kind of idea, and one that I've been a very heavy believer myself in, is this idea that adding experimental conditions adds constraints that improves your estimation, right? If you're just trying to estimate on one condition, your estimation will be poorer than if you have multiple conditions that you can constrain a parameter over because it kind of better separates out the parameters. This is something I always kind of believe myself, just intuitively. I think there's probably some papers that have done some basic versions of this that I can't remember off the top of my head. But this doesn't seem to, again, this doesn't seem to bear out in the simulations, right? So to explain these plots briefly, rows are non-decision time threshold drift rate estimation. And this is estimating the parameters that don't vary over condition, right? So when there's only one condition, obviously we've got estimates for all of them. Drift cons is when drift rate's varying over conditions, which means we don't have a single condition estimate of drift rate, but we do for the other two. Thresh cons is when thresholds varying. So again, no estimate for thresholds, but estimates for the other two. And then non-decision time cons, non-decision times varying, but we've got separate estimates for the other two, right? The key thing to look at here is, do the estimates over here look particularly better than the estimates here, right? And in general, the estimates here look very good, right? And while you could argue there's perhaps some minor improvements, but particularly for threshold with drift rate, you don't really seem to see much improvement, right? Like, again, so you could argue there's some improvement, but this doesn't seem to be a massive, poorly identified to very well identified, right? It doesn't really even seem to be like a complete structural change in things, right? The other key thing and the between trial variability parameters, right? So same thing again, but this time for STER, SZ, and SV. The one case where this does seem to be true, where constraint really does help, is actually a threshold manipulation heavily constraining STER. So as you can see, STER does pretty well in all other cases, but when there's a threshold manipulation, it does really well, right? So there does seem to be a case where the experimental constraint does really help, but it doesn't seem to be globally true, right? Now, you may then say, well, we may as well use these experimental constraints because, things aren't getting any worse though, right? They may not be getting particularly, oh, sorry, yep. Oh, sorry, I thought it was a question. My bad, sorry to call you out. things aren't getting particularly better, but they're not getting worse, right? But this isn't necessarily true, because then let's say we look at, sorry, I should make this clear. In this context, I used 4 conditions for each manipulation. So a lowest condition, next highest, next highest, next highest. And then this is for the estimated drift rates for the drift rate manipulation, threshold for the threshold manipulation, non-decision time for the non-decision time manipulation, right? And things get worse, right, when you're letting something vary over conditions. So just to go back, you know, when we're estimating these things over a single condition, they all look pretty good, right? But, you know, the lowest drift rate condition is awful. And the second one's not much better, right? And these ones are still substantially worse than just estimating drift rate by itself, right? And I mean, intuitively, I feel like this one's kind of easy to understand, right? In the context of you're splitting the data, you like the other parameters you'll get as much data to estimate on, right? But now you're kind of splitting in quarters the amount of data you have to estimate each one of these parameters, right? Which makes them more difficult to estimate. And so I think that's a key thing to keep in mind, right? Of course, I should mention that all these issues kind of go away if you just have enough trials, right? Like if you're doing like, particularly like some of the stuff that like Philip would do with like your, and Dan would do, you know, small is beautiful type thing, right? Your big number of trials, experiments, doesn't really matter, right? Because you've got so many, you know, trials per cell, right? But I think this is these ones were in terms of 200 total, so now 50 per condition. What you more realistically see in like applied settings, right? And things can get worse, right? So I think the key takeaway message from that one is that you need to carefully think about whether you're using an experimental manipulation, right? It should be meaningful if you use it, and I don't think it should be a throwaway thing that you do. Yep.
Are there ways to fit the parameters? They use a hierarchical approach to all the
Good point, good point. So I haven't done this in the context of the hierarchical stuff, just because that creates a very taxing simulation. I think this would ease it to an extent that increasing the trials would ease it, right? Because I guess like theoretically with the hierarchical stuff, you get data sharing, but not perfect sharing. So I guess it would, if you've got like 100 people, that sharing would probably help the estimation, right? The issue with the hierarchical recovery is, I guess now you're focusing on the generating group level, whether generating individual level. Sorry, to answer your question though, yes, I think it would improve it, and it should, you know, theoretically, right? But I haven't actually done these simulations, no. Okay. Sorry, that was, I went pretty deep dive into those simulations. Sorry, fun. Oh, sure. No problem. Charles asked about if those results hold in a hierarchical context. All right. So the second bit here is talking about, does the random dot motion task really need time varying drift rates? And so if you don't know what the random dot motion, random dot kinetogram, RDK, RDM, whatever you want to call it, task is, it's essentially this task where you get a cloud of dots and some portion of these dots move in a coherent direction, right? So sometimes you have very easy trials like this one, where you've got 40% motion coherence. So 40% of the dots are moving in a coherent direction. Sometimes you've got hard/impossible trials where no percentage of dots are moving in a coherent direction, and your job is to judge which direction the dots are coherently moving in. And then of course sometimes not. Oh, sorry, there's a thing in chat that's not, was that just saying, right, cool, easy. Okay, and so some recent-ish work by Phil and Simon Wilbur raise some, what I think are very valid concerns, right, about the random dot motion task and selective influence, right? And so their kind of key points was that and with a very thorough literature review, they showed good, you know, psychophysical evidence that that the integration of motion may result in time varying drift rates, right? So in this random dot motion task, because of the time taken to integrate stuff, I'll show you the plot of it later, but you may get like a buildup, right, where drift rate is very small to begin with and then kind of ramps up. And then the second point, that inferences about selective influence, such as this recent Dutil et al. Paper using the RDK, may not be valid because, you know, they're using a paradigm that will cause time varying drift rates, but the model doesn't include time varying drift rates, right? And in their paper was quite long, so lots of things happened. This is a very coarse summary. But, you know, they found a reduction in selective influence violations when applying a time varying model to the data. And, you know, made what I felt were at least people have interpreted as general conclusions kind of against using random dot motion tasks, or at least against using them if you're not using time varying drift rate models, right? And to give you a quick rundown, I won't go through all of it, but essentially this is the kind of differential equation. As you can see, it's like a standard diffusion model, but now you've got this time varying parameter in here, which varies over time. So you've got time varying drift and time varying noise, which varies according to this function. If you're not visualizing the math in your head, which, you know, neither am I, right? It makes the drift rate and the noise look something like this, right? At the start, nothing's happening because you're still integrating the motion, and over time it kind of ramps up to the point where you hit your normal drift rate. So this is their idea of time varying drift rates in this paper. All right. However, while I think the concerns are very valid and the rationale behind them are very valid, I think for A and B, which are, you know, that time to show that, you know, we may have a time varying drift rate in RDK, and to show that this may influence inferences about selective influence, I feel like a few things need to be tested, right? A few things need to be true, right? Which I don't feel like were in the original paper, right? Which is that, one, it should be the case that if you're using a time varying model and you're trying to say that it reduces the number of selective influence violations found, then these parameters should be identifiable that you're trying to make the inferences with, right? Secondly, it should also be the case where if I generate data with a time varying model and then refit it with a standard diffusion model, it should make false alarms about selective influence, right? If your argument is that the underlying process is a time varying drift rate and you're fitting it with a non-time varying drift rate, and this is causing issues with selective influence inferences, then logically, if you were to generate with this model and then fit with the simpler model, then you should get more violations than are actually true, right? Thirdly, you should see tasks with shorter integration time. So like essentially non-motion tasks, things like brightness discrimination in the context that I use here. Tasks with shorter integration time should show evidence against time varying model, right? They should be in favor of a standard diffusion model. And then lastly, these random dot motion tasks should consistently show evidence for the time varying model, right? Not just perhaps in Dutil et al. All right, so number one, again, we're back in recovery plot hell, I'm sorry. And so these are the estimates of the key ones to look at essentially are these three, right? There are a lot of parameters in the model, but to simplify it a bit, the key ones you want to look at these three, right? Diff is the estimate of the differences between conditions in non-decision time. Diff is the estimate of the differences between conditions in thresholds, and Diff is the estimation of the differences in drift rate between conditions, right? Essentially, this is a simulation context of trying to judge selective influence violations, right? Or whether parameters, how well you can judge whether these parameters differ between conditions, right? Essentially, in this time varying model, the estimation of non-decision time between conditions very good, right? Like about as perfect as the regular diffusion model, right? Diff is good. As you can see, the correlation is very high, but a bit weird, right? Diff seems to be a case where there's like a line drawn here and like you can figure out whether the effect is negative or positive, but the magnitude's a bit bad, right? So you'd still be able to, it still feels like you can separate, you know, kind of null from negative from positive, which means you're still good at, you know, figuring out whether there's violations or not, whether there's changes across conditions, but, you know, the exact magnitude's not so good. And Diff is awful, essentially. You can't really tell whether it's -5 or +5 or 0, right? Or anything in between. So the key point here is that while the time varying model can identify some differences between conditions, essentially non-decision time and threshold, it can't really be used to make inferences about whether drift rate varies over conditions because of this massive identifiability problem. So I think some caution needs to be taken with the original paper in terms of inferences about drift rate varying or not varying between conditions. All right, so second bit is that, well, what about if I'm generating with this time varying model, but fitting with the regular diffusion model, right? And again, a few parameters, but the key ones to focus on are the same ones, right? Again, this is generating with a time varying model and fitting with a regular diffusion model. And the interesting aspect is the estimation of non-decision time does get a bit worse. It's still very good, I'd say, but gets a bit worse. But estimating the difference in A between conditions and the difference in drift rate between conditions is actually pretty similar to just when you're estimating the time varying model, right? Like, of course, like drift rate's still an abomination, right? But no more so than when you're just estimating the time varying model itself, right? So the key point here is that it doesn't look like generating with a time varying model is pushing some very weird things to happen when you estimate with a standard model that would result in a lot of false alarms about selective influence, right? About effects happening over conditions. Three, so if the time varying model is kind of something that's happening in the RDK, but not in lots of other basic perceptual tasks that we use, then we'd expect to see consistent evidence for a time varying model in RDK paradigms, but against the time varying model in standard paradigms, right? These are two brightness discrimination tasks. To explain these plots, these are BIC probability plots. The x-axis is different subjects, so you get a different dot for each person. And this BIC probability is the probability of the time varying model being the best model versus the standard diffusion model, right? So essentially in Ray et al. 2014 down here, we get a whole lot of people saying that the time varying model is the best model, right? In contrast, in Evans et al. 2017, we get a lot of people saying that the standard model is the best model, right? Interestingly though, these are both brightness discrimination paradigms, right? Yep. Yeah, in actual fact, it was like the exact same experimental codes, but in different different settings. I think actually one minor thing to that, I think Ray et al. Also intermixed some Maya trials, some response signal trials. So that is a bit of a difference between the paradigms. But in terms of the trials, the paradigms themselves, they were almost exactly identical. I think they were exactly identical apart from that. Yep. Pardon? Oh. Shit. I'm sorry, everyone. Dan asked, were these paradigms the same? Ray et al. And Evans et al. And yes, but I think Ray et al. Included some Maya trials as well. Yeah, so they're the same, but we get quite different evidence here, right? Like in both cases, it's kind of clear, right? We get very clear, almost everyone's favoring the time varying model here, right? But almost no one's favoring the time varying model here, right? But again, this is brightness discrimination where we expect it to more be like this, right? Not many people favoring the time varying model. This one I've added in here because I made the plot like this and it was 2 a.m. and I didn't want to change it in time. Anyway, but this is a random dot motion task, right? This is Dutil et al. This, to be clear, this isn't the full data set. It takes the key, they divided their data set into pseudo experiments that we use for the competition. This takes kind of the key, this is the key pseudo experiment that was the focus of the competition, right? Where lots of people found selective influence violations, essentially. And so again, here in this random dot motion paradigm, we find lots of evidence for, like most people show strong evidence for the standard model, right? The non-time varying model, right? And the reason I put that there is then I've got this plot, which I hope doesn't give anyone like a seizure or something, because of course I picked the brightest colors possible, right? Now, this is to kind of answer, this is a slight tangent to what it says up the top, but this is to try and answer a bit more of the question of, well, do we see more selective influence violations when we're fitting a standard diffusion model, right? And so this is BIC probability again, except now 1 is in favor of an effect between conditions, so a selective influence violation, and 0 is against it, right? Blue dots are the standard diffusion model, green dots are the time varying diffusion model, right? The key thing to note here is that a lot more of the green dots are in this no selective influence violation than blue dots, right? Like here we see a much higher share of green dots down here than blue dot. There's a lot more blue dots up here and a lot more green dots down here, right? We see it does seem to be the fact that the standard diffusion model is producing more selective influence violations than the time-varying diffusion model, right? Which would lead some credibility to what Smith and Lilburn said, right? But the issue is that the time-varying, now this is back to probability plots. It's again, no selective influence violation versus selective influence violation, but now it's averaged over standard and time-varying diffusion models, right? Essentially what this means is that it's only really showing the comparison of the models that do the best, right? It's essentially comparing the standard and time-varying diffusion model and just displaying selective influence according to what model's doing best, right? The key thing you'll probably notice here is for Evans et al. Dutil et al., which I showed before, most people prefer the standard diffusion model. The black line and the blue, the black dots and the blue dots are kind of the same, right? This is just essentially because the standard diffusion model is always winning, right? So it doesn't matter in a sense that the time-varying model isn't showing selective influence violations because it's doing worse when penalized for complexity than the standard diffusion model, right? Same case kind of here with Ray et al., right? Like we do get some reduction in the selective influence violations, but not quite as much, right? Essentially, the key point I'm trying to make here is that it seems like although particularly in these data sets, we get a great reduction in selective influence violations when fitting with the time-varying diffusion model, it's often in cases where the time-varying model is itself doing worse than the regular diffusion model, right? Yep.
Is that saying that there's a model which fits better, but it can't actually reproduce the effect, the qualitative pattern of effects that we obtain?
Not necessarily this. I'd more so say that it's they're attributing the effect to different things, right? Where the standard diffusion model is fitting better and attributing it to a selective influence violation, instead of the time-varying model, it's getting soaked up in the time-varying drift rate. So I'd say different explanations for the same kind of thing, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Fuck. Sorry. Wait. How did you?
So what I said was, is this saying that there's a model that fits better that can't qualitatively explain?
Right. So yeah. So Dan asked, is this a kind of a difference between quantitative comparison and qualitative fit, right? And the point I kind of tried to make was it seems to be the case where it's on quantitative fit and they're both explaining it well, but with different mechanisms and such, right? The key bit I want to get to in a moment is, the other thing is now getting on to point 4. So again, that was RDK. This is RDK again. Essentially, I only fit 2 RDK data sets, and they both actually showed strong evidence against the time-varying model, right? So in both RDK data sets, this Dutil pseudo-experiment, and this random RDK data set that I have lying around and I've never published, but just always throw at these kind of situations. Again, we've got most people showing very strong evidence for the standard diffusion model, right? So not really seeing this evidence for the time-varying model. Now the question is, well, what the hell's going on, right? Sometimes the time-varying model is favored, sometimes it's not. Doesn't really seem to be clear when, right? At least not to me, right? And so I did some digging around, and it seems to be that distributional fast errors is the thing that seems to be causing it. Now I'll explain this with some plots in a minute, but this idea of distributional fast errors is not just the idea that error response times being faster than correct response times, but not just at the start of the distribution, across the whole distribution, right? So if you take the 0.1 quantile of the distribution, errors will be faster than corrects, but also if you take the 0.9 quantile, errors will be faster than corrects. And this seems to be a pretty good predictor of what we're seeing, right? When we look at this, right, participants who showed this trend, 32 of 40 who showed the trend favor the time-varying diffusion model, and only 6 of 61 who didn't show the trend. Yep. Yeah. No. Sorry, these are excellent point. These are completely different thought patterns that I never put together. That's actually a very good point. I think that'll be a good one to do. Thank you. Yeah. No. That's good. No, you've put me into a thought. Yeah, because it's interesting. But yeah, six of 61 who didn't, only 6 of 61 who didn't show this trend varied the time varying model, right? So proportionally, that seems to make sense. But when I did some more intensive these simulations weren't super intensive, and my God, the plots came out awful. Anyway, the key point here is that green reflects situations where we're getting these distributional fast errors, right? Red reflects situations where we're not getting distributional fast errors. Sorry. I was slightly incorrect on that. I forgot how I did my own goddamn plots. Sorry. Green is just fast errors. Red is slower errors, right? Edge is when they're in the leading edge. So like the 0.1 quantile I think I used. Mean is when they're at the mean of the distribution. So is mean correct response time faster than a mean error response time? Tail is the 0.9 quantile. So errors faster than corrects in the tail of distribution. And all is, do we see it across the whole distribution, right? And then we have, so this is the time constant model. This is the time varying model. On the x-axis, we have different SV values. So drift rate variability values. On the y-axis, we have different SZ values, starting point variability values. And essentially the key point here is that the time constant diffusion model is pretty good at causing fast errors in the leading edge, right? So we get this kind of fast error effect in the leading edge for the time constant model, right? Again, only when SV is kind of small, kind of as expected. But, you know, as we get bigger, as said, you know, we can get some leading edge effects, right? However, this goes away in the mean for the most part, very much goes away in the tail, right? So the only way to really get this kind of distributional fast errors in the standard diffusion model is to have really low SV and really high SZ, right? And in general, this isn't often realistic because lots of paradigms do require some between trial variability and drift rate, right? But this isn't the case at all with a time varying model, right? You can get, it just kind of generally seems to predict this distributional fast error behavior, right? You know, hit, edge, blah, blah, all like 90%, right? And so this, to me, at least from my exploration of things, kind of seems to be the key factor, right? This time varying model is being preferred in some situations, and I think is a well-developed model, and is very interesting, right? But what it seems to be picking up on seems to be a trend in the data that's this distributional fast errors, right? Which I think is interesting, but not quite perhaps the message of the original paper. So some thoughts on theoretical expansions for RT modeling. I'll go through this super quickly. We'll just fly through it, right? The point here is that I think we put ourselves in a bit of a box with RT modeling, right? That RT and accuracy become the things that we predict, right? I've seen, you know, many talks from senior academics where they're like, you know, we'd like to have more information, but RT and accuracy is all that we have, right? To apply our models to and to constrain our models, right? And I don't think this has to be the case, right? I think, you know, most people think that other things either aren't of interest or belong in other aspects, like front ends of the, like belong elsewhere, right? But I think my key point here is that I'm trying to make very quickly because I ran out of time because I'm not good at time management, is that often I feel like to a certain extent we're afraid to certain parts of RT modeling, we're happy to try and extend and move things. So I think like the circular diffusion model is a very good example of like extending what we do in RT modeling. But I think other circumstances is less so, right? Like I think there's a lot of valuable information out there, whether it be neuroscience, arm reaching, this kind of stuff, that our models could be very well applied to and can very well inform our models, but we're not sufficiently using, right? Essentially, the point I was going to make here through this is through mimicry. You know, we get a lot of mimicry in RT and accuracy, so it seems reasonable that we should move on. Blah blah blah. I didn't mean to. That was this. There was an explanation for this. I was trying to say that it's not crossing out these papers because I like all of these papers. The point being that, well, I think one of the potential solutions here is moving towards a more continuous view of evidence accumulation, right? And I don't mean continuous like circular diffusion model. While I think that's a good avenue, I kind of conceptualize this as a spectrum, right? And you've got continuous responding, you've got detection to continuous responding, and you've got single time measurement to continuous measurement. And like, I think most of the time we research in this area, you know, single measurement in time, you know, very discrete responding. This line is essentially mostly Philip's work. That, you know, has taken us up to very continuous responding with circular diffusion models. Obviously, there's other ways that this is being done, but I think that's, you know, being kind of the key revelation in how this is done. This is kind of like some work I've done with like Mathieu and stuff on like double responding, EMG, this kind of stuff that allows more measurements. But the key point is that I think there's this whole spectrum that we could be exploring, right? But I think really we're stuck in kind of this area, right? We're not trying to see how we could get more measurements of the decision-making process to better constrain our models. And so, skipping through all that, yeah, there's some funky math stuff. Anyway, but I think the key thing for me going forward is I think we should be looking to some of these other paradigms that are commonly used elsewhere and other sources of data that are commonly used elsewhere, and seeing how we can better use them to constrain the evidence accumulation process itself of the models, right? So like mouse tracking, some kind of preference tracking, which is a figure I made for my grant that looks really bad. You know, perhaps single cell recording, EEG recordings. I don't think they've, these have been used in the past, but I don't think in a very good manner, the EEG recordings. I think there's better ways to use them to constrain the models. Anyway, the key mishmash conclusion here is that I think it's very mishmash. But I think the kind of thought process I had when making this talk was that I feel like going in and having done my PhD and stuff in this area, there's a lot of beliefs you kind of pick up, right? But I think these beliefs aren't always true. And while they're usually based on some kind of evidence, modeling such a rapidly developing field with, you know, technology and increasing computational power that, you know, we can better evaluate these things each and every year, right? I feel like most of the things I looked at here were essentially harnessing a lot of this computational power to look at some of these questions that things I've always just believed that probably should have questioned more, right? And so hopefully everyone else will follow, not follow, but do something similar, I guess, and question their own beliefs on things. And hopefully you've learned, or at least can question something interesting from my talk. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me, and sorry for running over time.
Thank you, everyone. Clap, clap, clap. We're all clapping online. I see, so we don't have that much time for questions, but I see a few. So I see Philip online. Should we start with Philip, and then if there's anyone in person,
this would be the fun
we'll have time for one from there.
Yep, I think you're muted, Phil. But yep. No, you're muted now. Yep.
And now?
Yeah, you're all good.
Okay, thank you, Nathan, for rescuing me from marking an honours thesis on attachment styles and emotional regulation. Look, the question, well, I guess it's a comment and inviting you to respond in terms of the theoretical purpose of the time-varying diffusion model, right, for the random dot motion task. You have presented it and you've talked about it very much as a kind of an estimation issue. And if we simply compare alternative conceptualizations and how the estimation properties behave, and that's perfectly reasonable. But the point about the original theory was that it was actually informed by the visual psychophysics, which basically say you look at the temporal integration properties of that task in a visual psychophysical context, and it looks as though there is a constant temporal integration time which is the same across different levels of coherence. So that doesn't look like decisional integration, it looks like perceptual integration. So really it was attempting to take a theoretical proposition which was not pulled out of thin air, but it was derived from inferences about the psychophysics, and saying, what will that bias? And the interesting thing that it seem to bias, and that's the point of the paper, is that the selective influence violations in relation to non-decision time were reduced. And that seemed to me to be a principled way of taking it out of the realm of pure abstract estimation and bringing in theoretical propositions which were derived from other sorts of studies and other sorts of paradigms.
Right. I thank you for bringing this up, because I think it's a good point that I brushed over because of time-wise, because I think I kind of did just present it as, look, there's a time-varying function, look what's going on, et cetera, right? But I think you're right. I think the literature review from your paper is very fantastic, right? And brings up some very great ideas and some very principled ideas. And I very much like the model itself, right? And I think this is perhaps an issue too, that perhaps differs between what you wrote in a paper versus what people extrapolate from a paper too, right? And so I think the key things for me are, I think the model itself is good and interesting and very useful. And I think it definitely has a purpose, right? My qualms are, I don't think it necessarily I don't think the evidence necessarily shows that using a standard diffusion model on an RDK will give you invalid inferences. I think that's the key point I kind of wanted to get across here. Whether it is true that the underlying process is time varying or not, I couldn't really find much evidence that would show that this made things worse. Like in terms of, the simulation showed that even if you're fitting to time varying data, you get similar conclusions. And, in a lot of contexts, when complexity corrected, the standard diffusion model was winning, right? And so I think perhaps there are paradigms where, perhaps this is a mimicry issue, right? And the models aren't well enough distinguished in these paradigms and it's a more data thing, blah, blah, blah. But at least in the context I looked at, there didn't seem to be evidence to suggest that people should be lambasted, attacked for using a standard diffusion model on an RDK, right? And again, I don't think this is necessarily the point of your paper, but this is some of the takeaway message that others may have had from it.
Look, if I can just follow that up briefly without monopolizing things completely. So in terms of the mimicry issue, we kind of know very precisely what the mimicry issue will be, because if the diffusion rate is time varying, or the drift and diffusion increases to an asymptote, what matters is the integral, and that will be well modeled by a shifted linear function. So you basically, the properties of the model are such that you would expect that any time varying component in the standard model will appear in the non-decision time. And so, if that's the case, you would expect, and indeed I have lots of simulations that will actually show the standard model does really well under those circumstances. And the effects, if they're going to turn out, are going to turn out in the non-decision time. But the other thing that I did want to also mention, that you made the claim that if the model has any theoretical substance or value, then it should correctly indicate or correctly identify the lack of time varying effects in tasks where there are no timing varying effects. And so perhaps a comment also about the Smith and Ratcliffe 2022 psych review paper, which applied those sorts of models along with urgency gating stuff to the the true blood chromatic brightness task, and it actually showed that you actually don't do better with a model with time varying drift rates. So from the point of view of a sort of further sanity check on that model, it's actually it's pulling out the effect you would expect.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it's incorrectly identifying things in all cases, right? I think the Ray et al. Data, there's just something weird, I think, about the Ray et al. Data set, to be honest with you, right? It has some weird trends in it, like this distributional kind of fast errors, and I don't necessarily think it would do things wrong in all cases, right? Just that it did in that very specific case, right? But I agree. I think from that paper, it makes, you did show an example of it correctly not showing up where it shouldn't show up, right? But yeah, I think it's a case of, I'm not saying this model should be abandoned, right? I think just more investigation is needed, right? To kind of look at the properties, like what I did, but more extreme, I think eventually, right? Look at the properties better and better see where it does win out and doesn't win out.
Right.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to butt in, but I'm conscious of time, 12:05. I don't know, are there people trying to get into the room? Because I think many people may have to go, but if you've got it for a little longer, we can maybe take one more question. Otherwise, we should probably stop. I can't tell what's going on in the room. So, yeah. Anyone in the room want to?
It says has the room booked, but I can't see it out there. It doesn't have a name.
We can't hear.
Oh, room appears to be booked, but people ain't here.
Right. Okay. Well, let's take one more question then and call that good. And yeah, but that way, someone in the room, if you have any questions. Or not, if there's no one, I can't actually see.
You can't, can you hear Chris? No? Right. I'll move close. Yep. No, I love interrogations. Yep. Sure. Oh, sorry. Which I have. Gotcha. Sure. Sure. Oh, excellent. Okay, excellent point, right? Okay. So I don't want to say anything 100% because there's all sorry. Chris's point, if you couldn't hear it, I'm remembering to do things now, is well, at the end of the day, the point of mathematical psychology often is, not just are things happening, but why are things happening, right? And the question is for this error RT stuff, well, why are we seeing this, right? Why are we seeing, I don't know why I'm holding it up. I did my whole talk like this. Anyway, why are we seeing this lack of change when we exclude error RTs, right? Okay, good point. One, I think from what I looked at, the most constraining parts of the errors doesn't seem to be the RTs, it seems to be the proportion, right? So if you throw out proportion, then things go to shit, right? But it seems like the proportions are very constraining. And then secondly, it seems like you get a lot more information from the shape of the correct time response distribution than I think people often think, right? So like, it's pretty clear, right? I think that pure proportions can only get you so far, right? I mean, like, that's why we need RTs in general, right? So there's only so many things left, right, that it could be, right? And you're right, I should explore this why more. But it seems pretty clear to me that there are aspects of the shape of the response time distribution that are informing SV and SZ a lot better than we think, right? Whereas we think it's the difference between correct and error RTs. It seems to be heavily informed by the shape of the correct response time distribution. Yeah. Yeah, it's all good. He's not here. Yep. Yep. Okay. Right. Yeah. Right.
We can't hear.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So just so we can't hear Chris at all. Chris?
No problem. I was just, doing my years in between people's questions to show that I'm listening.
Yeah.
I did undergrad psychology. I'm an active listener. So Chris's point was, well, if I'm doing a task, right, and kind of along the lines of sequential effects ideas, right, if I'm doing a task and I make an error, then aspects of this error will probably be seen in at least, n+1 but subsequent trials, right? There are signatures of errors that appear in data set outside of the error itself, right? Did I get that? Yep. Cool. Good. Okay. Yes, I agree. But the key thing to keep in mind here, though, is that these are simulations I did with an IID assumption, right? So I agree in practice, you could, probably use other information to locate it, right? But I guess this is the part that then really shocked me, right? Because this is, like true model simulations with the IID assumption, right? There's also the issue you could bring up here of, well, this model's wrong, right? So, will the wrongness of it kind of screw things up? And I think that's another question, you know, adding in some more contaminants, this kind of stuff, extra stuff I'd like you to see, you know, how far can you really push this? But yeah, for me, I think the other aspect is, as you kind of said before, I think it would be good to understand better, well, what aspects of the correct response time distribution are really heavily informing SV as such.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I'm gonna call time. That's great.
Sure.
Yeah.
May I keep talking to people though?
You may totally keep talking to people, and I think anyone online who wants to hang out, go ahead. Mainly, but feel free to go if you must. Everyone will give another final clap. Nathan, thank you for coming. And
thank you so much for having me.
No problem. And yeah, it's really great to see it spurred so much discussion. So absolutely keep talking and everything, particularly without the room. Thank you.
Thank you.